What we do here as Shady Historians, we talk about queer, people of color, millennial issues, and we tie that back into American history. So if this is something that you're interested in, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. What this episode is going to focus on is queer male relationships in the American frontier and what we can learn about those relationships in our past to apply those lessons to today. Something that's very important before we start. When I talk about American history, I don't talk about American history as in told over one event after another event after another event. I talk about it as told over several different times and distances simultaneously and tying them back together within the same narrative point or frame. Since the United States declared its independence in 1776, there has always been land to the west that it wanted to claim for itself. This territory was seen as a part of the American frontier, everything going from the Mississippi River to the Pacific West Coast. President George Washington himself, the man who's on our money, as well as, owning several hundred slaves, referred to the United States as a rising empire. Therefore, the first 100 years of our nation's foreign and domestic policy oftentimes focus on this expansion. The first major expansion that was actually done after the American War of Independence for the United States was the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the then United States, and it was negotiated by our third president, Thomas Jefferson, in relation to Napoleon in France. Now, Napoleon needed the extra money because they were fighting the revolution in Haiti at the time, and he was getting his ass kicked by the Haitians. The United States would continue to expand further westward under the presidency of James K. Polk. It's one of the most important one-term presidents in American history. He's important because of what happened while he was in office. The Mexican-American War, which was fought between 1846 and 1848. The Mexican-American War was fought between the United States and the new Republic of Mexico. Now, the war resulted in Mexico losing over half of its territory to the United States and the annexation of Texas. The war resulted in the United States expanding further out to the Pacific Ocean. The crazy thing about the war is that the territory that's gained during the war will become a major cause within the Civil War, which happened 12 years later. President Polk's presidency also results in the Northwestern Territories, which include the modern-day states of Oregon and Washington, becoming a part of the United States. Americans were very excited about this new territory. Well, it wasn't too new because there was indigenous people there, but they thought of it as new. They were so excited about it that it became a movement known as Manifest Destiny. Americans had the right to go all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So, we're getting to the heart of why you came to this episode. Queer male relationships, American frontier. Everyone came to the West. Every single type of person you can imagine came to the West or was already in the West at the time. The thing is, the West was settled by multiple different types of people. Every different type of race, every different type of ethnicity that you can imagine, including religious minority groups as well. But there were way more men in the West than there were women in the West. You tended to associate with the gender that you were with. And what we call that is separate gender sphere. So your most predominantly healthy, deep, emotional relationships were tended to be with members of the same gender, not different genders. So the separate gender sphere meant that men associated with men and women associated with women as it related to their closest interpersonal, social, emotional, developmental relationship, right? So when historians look over a lot of the documentation for the 19th century, they see these patterns of these love stories, but they're not love stories that happen usually amongst people of separate genders. They're love stories that usually happen within genders. Depending on the historian that you're talking to, they might look at the relationship as being more friendly, or they might look at it being more romantic, or they might look at it being even an entanglement. Native Americans who were living in the territory at the time had different concepts when it came to gender and sexual fluidity than the Americans who were moving into the territory. The terminology for this came to be known as two spirited people. Sometimes these observations that were made by Americans who were moving further and further west onto the Native American tribes that were there. So sometimes they thought they were hypersexualized, or they kind of exoticized them and fetishized them. So as historians look over those primary source documents of these Americans who were moving further and further westward, and the observations that they were making with Native Americans, it's very important that they keep in mind those natural biases, well, unnatural biases, but these biases of socialization that many of these Americans had. Now sometimes what could potentially happen is, as these American frontier people moved further and further to the west and had more interactions with these Native Americans who had different ideas and concepts of gender and sexual fluidity, there also became this kind of horrible sexual projection that they put onto the Native Americans. So what happened oftentimes with Western settlers was make these observations about Native American groups of people which were not completely true. So sometimes there's this horrible fetishization of Native Americans that happen. And actually that's historic. That's something that's been happening a lot through not only American history, but also this European conquest of the Americas as it relates to sex and Native Americans. But it's important to keep that in mind as we talk about this. There was an aristocrat by the name of William Stewart. He was from Scotland. He traveled throughout the American frontiers in the 1830s and 1840s. He was involved in a lot of fur trading businesses in America. But he chose to come over so many times because he enjoyed the sexual freedoms that America allowed him that Western Europe did not allow him at the time. For instance, he had a partner of up to 10 years who was part Cree and Native American, and they traveled together throughout the American frontier. He wrote about it in his journals, and also he wrote about it in some novels as well, but it was a very well documented case that he really felt that he could be himself in the Americas. People felt more sexually free in the American frontier than they did in the original United States territory. Now, unfortunately, William Stewart had to leave the Americas because there was a bit of an incident that happened. No one knows the exact circumstances, but he had a party. The party involved like 50 young men. And they dressed up in different kind of Renaissance themes and costumes, right? Now, it was rumored that it was an orgy. We do not know if it was an orgy. It's possible it was an orgy. But he had to go. Not saying there's anything wrong with that. But this was the 1840s, so yeah. Now, the next era that I want to take us to is California in the 1840s and 1850s, a time period that's known as the gold rush. In the 1840s, the discovery of gold led to hundreds of thousands of people descending on California simultaneously to make it rich. Now, many of these towns which came up as a result of the gold rush were majority male, some of them as high as 70 to 90%. For instance, San Francisco in 1849 had 400 women compared to a population of 25,000 men. Additionally, these towns also in some cases have very lax policies when it came to segregation, with some encampments having several different races living together at once. With this happening, with so few women in these environments, what happened was that men took on more roles that were seen as traditional women roles, right? There would be men who would take on roles such as cooking, or such as cleaning, or such as being a dance partner to all male parties. Not only would there be men who would go together to these dance hall parties, but in some incidents there would be men who would dress up as women partners in these dance hall parties. In some incidents there would be women who would also dress up as men. If sex was to happen amongst men, they would not necessarily be seen as homosexual behavior. As Peter Brown wrote in his 2003 book, Same-Sex Affair, in all male societies, it was not unusual for sexual relationships to occur. People engaged in same-sex activities were not seen as homosexuals. There was even a great saying, young cowboys had a great fear that old studs, once filled with beer, completely addled, they throw on the saddle and ride him in the rear. But with all this information, can we say if these men were queer? We really can't specifically say because of the nature of the separate gender spheres themselves, right? It might have not been that big of a deal for two men back in the 1850s to go to a party, to share a bed, for one of them to dress up as a woman and to have this relationship, but for the relationship to not be sexual. It's possible. But also, part of me kind of doubts it. Let's say, for instance, that these men, right? These men just have really close emotional bonds, right? They have these really great emotional friendships that went on deep and so on and so forth. And that's completely capable, you know? I think to myself, like, many of the closest friendships that I have in my life tend to not be sexual friendships. You know, they tend to be friendships that I have built over years, sometimes decades, sometimes it's members of the same gender, sometimes it's members of who identify as either one of the genders, right? Or one of many, right? And I think that there's something to say to that, particularly when I look at, you know, men. When I look at us, you know, regardless if we're queer, if we're straight, or we're gay, whatever the case might be, there's like a potential lack of like emotional intimacy for us at times, to really open up to one another, to really be vulnerable. And it's something that I observed the more that we go through this pandemic, for instance, right? You know, the rate of anxiety amongst us, the rate of depression amongst us, and how we just keep those things inside, right? And we don't talk about it. We might mention it to our significant others, or we might mention it to a friend randomly, but we never really talk about those actual issues that we're really, really going through. We just hold them in. And you know, I look at the men of the West who, let's say they weren't queer or they weren't gay, you know, even though, as I mentioned before, I think something was going on, but let's say that they weren't. Let's do the opposite argument. Isn't that like a great emotional vulnerability, you know? And I feel that even as men, even as we become more gender neutral in our spaces, and I include queer men in this as well, there's still that lack and that challenge of just having that sense of emotional intimacy. I just think of the men who I have dated or just talked to on any kind of level, and that vulnerability part is like, whoa, that just shows up. And it might not be there with like physical appearances. It might be not there with, you know, even traditional gender norms in the way they dress and the way they talk, but the emotional part of it, the emotionality, it's like Racheal off. And I wonder, you know, what if we took the lessons from the West to really be open, to really have that sense of vulnerability, you know, not just in our physical appearances, but in our mental state, in our emotional state. How fascinating, how great would that just be for guys just to chill and relax? And you know, it's a crazy thing when you look over some of these journal entries. There was like this emotional availability that they just felt with one another. Didn't mean they were super macho, it didn't mean they didn't have all those kind of toxic masculinity, but at least like the emotional state amongst us was a little bit different. I don't know, maybe we could get back to that, you know, but with better lube.